Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about the not-so-fun part of medieval travel. It's not about knights or fancy coaches. It's about the simple question of where your average peasant would sleep if they went more than a few miles from home. Now, turn the lights down low and maybe put on a fan for some background noise. It's like the sound of animals snoring in the next room, and it helps to set the mood for what's coming. In the Middle Ages, it was not easy to leave your village because you were a poor peasant. It was more like announcing to the world, I'm about to suffer recreationally. Because unlike nobles who have lots of servants, horses, and backup shoes, you were probably walking barefoot with a sack full of worry and maybe an onion. Most ordinary people didn't travel far. Why would they do that? The village had everything: bad bread, debt, and religious guilt. It also had the same 7 people you'd known since birth. But if your job called you to do a pilgrimage, work for a limited time, or run away from your landlord's henchmen, you packed your things. Things here, meaning a crust of bread, a rag cloak, and a stick for both walking and warding off geese. Journeys were long. Maps were for monks and pirates. If you couldn't find your way, you would just wander until someone shouted at you in a different language. We measured distances by how long it took for your feet to start bleeding and how many times you thought about sleeping in a bush. Before you leave, you could ask your village priest for a blessing. Ideally, it would cover wolves, demons, bandits, people who disobey the law, and overly curious farmers' daughters. If the priest liked you, he might even give you a turnip and a worried look. They are very supportive. Then it was time for the goodbye ritual. A serious wave from your grandmother, who was 38 but looked 93. A warning from your cousin not to get eaten, and your younger brothers and sisters trying to steal the bread out of your pocket as a goodbye gift. You walked. You walked slowly. You regretted everything. The road was muddy, with carts, animals, and sometimes knights who might accidentally knock you over. Every mile brought a new question. Am I lost? Is that man asleep or dead? Was this a bad idea? Yes, yes, and yes. But you carried on. Why? You had no choice. Or did you decide to look for work because your cousin told you there was a job in the next village? Or because a man selling religious souvenirs told you that if you walked to a monastery 3 days away, your sins would be forgiven? Spoiler, they didn't. And so your medieval journey began. You were broke, barefoot, and your optimism was at its highest just before your blisters appeared. So, you've been walking all day. Your feet are now more blister than flesh. You have not found anyone willing to house a traveler who has no money, who smells like damp thatch, and who is feeling very sad. Now is the time to think about the medieval peasant's most reliable shelter, the barn. Yes, the simple barn. It was built for creatures with hooves, but is often used by creatures who have made bad life decisions and who don't have much money. Barns are the perfect place for a peasant to stay overnight. A roof, straw that wasn't all moldy, and big, flat animals that gave off a warm and judgmental vibe. But don't just wander into any barn. First, you must ask the farmer for permission, which involves knocking on their door and praying they were not drunk, not armed, and that they did not already have 3 strangers sleeping in their barn. If they said yes, congratulations. You are now the proud guest of a cow, 6 chickens, and whatever rats hadn't left for the season. Sleeping in a barn had its good points. The straw felt rough, but it was better than dirt. If you lied down between 2 calm oxen, your body temperature might actually go above what it was for medieval corpses. But if one of them rolled over, your travel plans might be over for good. There are also strong smells and strong feelings. Barns smelt of fresh hay and barnyard cologne number 5. You weren't asleep. You were just very dizzy and sick. Then I heard pigs snorting, horses chewing, and the creaking of a wooden beam. Add in the occasional flea circus performing beneath your shirt, and you had all the makings of a very unpleasant rural experience. But beggars and ordinary people couldn't choose. A barn kept you dry, warm, and safe from wild animals. And in the morning, you might even get a piece of stale bread as thanks for not stepping on the goose. In the world of peasant lodging, the barn was somewhere between the miracle and the wet log. And compared to sleeping outside, it was like staying in a five-star hotel. The barn door was locked, the monastery turned you away, and the local innkeeper laughed so hard at your empty coin pouch that he almost choked on his own spit. That means only one thing. Tonight, dear traveler, you're sleeping outdoors. Let's start with the field. A traditional, flat, roomy, grassy field with cows. There are lots of cows. You might find a soft patch to lie on, unless it's already been used by cows or thistles, which are like nature's bedbugs. If you were smart, or just scared, you would aim for the edge of a field to avoid angry farmers. This way, you reduce the risk of being stepped on by animals or run away from a man named Godric who was angry and carrying a tool used for farming. Then there were the forests, which are great if you like feeling paranoid when you sleep. Forests were quiet, but in the way that haunted houses are quiet. Every time the twig snapped, I thought it was a clue to a murder mystery. Every time an owl hooted, it sounded like it was laughing at something. You were not really asleep, but rather in a kind of light sleep with one eye open. Plus, medieval forests were full of all sorts of characters like wolves, bandits, and if you asked the local priest, probably Satan himself. The wind through the trees could be calming, but it could also be worrying. If you made it through the night without getting frostbite or tooth marks, you thought it was a win. But some peasants liked being outside, especially in the warmer months. The stars were free to look at, unlike everything else, and the breeze helped mask the smell of your own unwashed body. It was damp and cold, and there were no flies. But at least you didn't have to pay rent. Some travelers carried cloaks or old blankets to make themselves more comfortable. Most of the clothes were made of rough wool, smelled like regret, and kept out the cold like a cabbage. If you lay down on your front and said a few words to a saint, you might be able to sleep for a few hours. Imagine you've been turned away from the pub because you couldn't afford a cheap beer or the landlord didn't like how you looked, like you had no money. You tried the fields, the forests, the barns, and now you're looking for a place that's peaceful and where you won't get kicked in the ribs by a goat. The churchyard. Yes, welcome to the hallowed ground of sleeping, where the good people rest in eternal peace. And you, the traveling peasant, try to get a few hours without rolling into a grave by accident. Churchyards were a popular place for the traveling peasant class. Why? Because they were public spaces, somewhat protected, and the dead rarely complained about them. People thought that sleeping near holy places would protect them spiritually, or at the very least stop bandits. Even the most experienced thief might think twice before robbing someone very close to a saint's funeral. Of course, there were risks. Local religious leaders did not like it when people who had no home turned their graveyards into camping sites. You might be woken up by a furious monk or a nun with a broom and no patience. If it was near a feast day or market, you weren't alone. The churchyard was like a messy sleepover for people who felt very awkward and unclean. But there were some good things about it. Some churches had covered porches called lich gates, where travelers could sleep relatively dry as long as the wind wasn't too strong. There was always the hope that a kind priest might pity you and give you some soup or bread, especially if you looked sad or had a good story about sick goats. If it rained, the graves offered a kind of comforting view. At least I'm not that guy. You think to yourself as you sit next to a stone covered in moss, wet but still alive. There's nothing like sleeping at the top of the stairs to really make you realize how much worse things could be. You might even get some of the holy feeling just by being near it. We might even catch some of its magic from the grass. Either way, it was better than fighting over a dry patch of mud in the alley behind the butcher's stall. Churchyards, because sometimes help from above looks like a mossy bench and a stern warning from Father Gregory. When you were too poor to stay in a pub, too cold to sleep in the woods, and too upset to sleep next to a dead body in a churchyard. There was one last glimmer of hope. The monastery. Yes, the serious stone churches of men who had promised to be poor, to be chaste, and to have haircuts that they later regretted. These were places where tired travelers might find food, a place to sleep, and a solid 8 hours of being judged by men who had voluntarily given up their shoes. Now, let's be clear. Monasteries were not like medieval bed and breakfasts. You didn't just walk up and ask for a room with a view and a side of me. You waited politely at the gate, often for hours, until a monk decided you weren't a heretic, a bandit, or, worst of all, a talkative heretic. If you pass this test, you will be welcomed as a guest under the ancient rule of hospitality. Treat the stranger as Christ, which sounds lovely until you realize it also meant cold floors, shared soup, and being woken at 3 a.m. by chanting that sounded like Gregorian monks arguing with bees. The monks fed you bread, watery vegetables, and something that looked like broth. If it had a flavor, it was probably like punishment. But after a day of feeling disappointed, even boiled leeks felt really good. But don't ask for seconds. That's how you get extra prayers instead of extra portions. The places to sleep were different. Some monasteries had guest halls, which were basically long rooms with benches, hay, and the faint scent of damp wool and holiness. You would sleep in a room full of people you didn't know. Try not to cough too loudly so as not to upset the cleaner with a broom. If the monastery didn't have enough money or there were too many people, you might be told to sleep in the cloister. This was basically a stone hallway where the sound of people walking and the wind made it very windy. But monks didn't ask for money. All they expected in return was that you didn't steal anything, didn't do anything disrespectful near the relics, and maybe confessed your sins, which after 5 nights outdoors probably included feeling envious, angry, and thinking about murdering a chicken. Was it luxurious? No, but it was calm, quiet, and made me feel a bit guilty, which is good for keeping you humble. So your feet are blistered, your shoes are worn out, and the barn owl you try to share a tree with last night almost pecked your nose off. Welcome to the real medieval Airbnb, the roadside shrine. These weren't grand cathedrals or even small chapels. They were more like holy vending machines. There are small stone or wooden buildings, sometimes with a statue of the Virgin Mary, a local saint, or a piece of something someone swore was once part of a martyr's fire. They were built at crossroads or along pilgrimage routes and had 2 main purposes: to encourage religious devotion and to provide enough shade for a nap without getting wet. For poor people traveling long distances, these shrines became places where they could rest. If you were lucky, the overhang would be big enough to sit under. Even better, you could huddle with your knees to your chest and pretend that damp stone was a mattress. Shrines didn't offer food, bedding, or bathrooms, but they did offer one very valuable thing: the ability to deny that they were there. If someone found you snoring at the foot of St. Mildred's, you could always claim you were praying loudly in your sleep. But not every shrine was happy to welcome travelers who didn't pay. Some were lovingly maintained by villagers who didn't like muddy visitors spoiling the view, but others were so remote that even the squirrels had forgotten about them. For tired travelers, that was basically like being in a 5-star hotel. It was fortunate that no one wanted to rob the shrine. It was just bad luck. Bandits might risk their souls for a merchant's pouch, but they would never steal next to a painted icon of St. Jerome with laser eyes and a smirk that suggests they are being unkind but not openly angry. There was also a spiritual side. Sleeping near a shrine made you feel safe, as if the saint would protect you. But this wasn't guaranteed. St. Hubert might protect you from werewolves, but probably not from trench shoot or aggressive squirrels. Even though it was cold, the rocks were damp, and there was a faint smell of holiness. Roadside shrines were still a popular place to go. They weren't comfortable, but they weren't in any worse situation either. By the 7th blister, the 15th, there is no room left, so you have to leave. And the 3rd time you were chased out of a barn by a donkey that didn't like other animals, you start to fantasize about a real bed, or at least a roof or soup. That's when the warm, flickering glow of an alehouse window starts to look less like a building and more like a magical creature with bad breath. In the Middle Ages, people would go to houses and taverns to meet each other. These places were like truck stops in the modern world. You could get cheap drinks and talk to people you didn't really know, and the room was so hot that you could steam up a window just by standing there. But for the traveling peasant, they were also one of the few places you could go inside where you didn't have to pretend to be holy or speak like a monk. Let's be clear, you couldn't just walk in and sleep on the bench. If you had money, you were welcome. If you didn't, the door made a loud noise as it slammed shut. The drink was the most important thing there. People drank ale, beer, and mead, made from whatever local yeast there was. Many a poor person would order a cup and drink it slowly over hours, hoping not to be thrown out. Sometimes the innkeepers were kind and let tired travelers sleep by the fire for a drink and a story. Other times they charged a few pennies for a straw bed in a corner, which you had to share with other people. Privacy was just a fantasy. You would sleep close to people you did not know. They would snore loudly and say things in their sleep that you could not hear. The floor was sticky, the benches uneven, and the fireplace smoke showed that oxygen was rare. But it was warm, and if you close your eyes tightly, you could imagine that the rats were just small, curious cats. Sometimes there were songs, sometimes fights, and sometimes both at once. But even though there was a lot of shouting and beer being spilled, there was a strange comfort in it all. It made you feel like you were still part of the big, dirty human race. In the past, people paid to stay in warm places where they could sleep. These places were called taverns. You could also get free ale in these places. Picture this. It's getting dark. The wolves are howling, or maybe just some very aggressive sheep. You can either sleep in a puddle or go and knock on a stranger's door. That stranger probably hasn't had a bath since Easter. It's time for the peasants to use their last survival strategy, asking for shelter. This wasn't quite the modern Airbnb experience. There were no reviews, no app, and certainly no fresh sheets. It was more like a roulette wheel with fleas on it. You picked a house that didn't look like a place where people usually got murdered. You walked up to it and asked politely if you could have a place by the fire. If you were lucky, the owner would let you in because they felt sorry for your blistered feet. If you were unlucky, they'd let the dog answer instead. Some families, especially in the countryside, were very friendly. Maybe they remembered what it was like to travel, or maybe they just liked the gossip that came with hosting a stranger. A good story was worth more than a hot bath. This was mostly because no one remembered what hot baths were. You would usually be given the least bad part of the house, near the fireplace if you were lucky, near the goat pen if you weren't. The bedding was made up of straw, an old cloak, and a pile of rags that smelt of rot. But at least it was indoors. You might even get a meal, a piece of bread, maybe some stew made from root vegetables, and water that didn't glow in the dark. In return, you were expected to be perfect. Don't steal, don't look at the daughter, and don't make any strange noises after bedtime. You were also expected to leave by sunrise, or you might be accused of overstaying your welcome and becoming a squatter. This all relied on trust, which in the medieval world was about as strong as a three-legged stool in a thunderstorm. But somehow it worked. People were proud of the fact that they sometimes gave things away, and travelers learned to be modest, thankful, and not stand out too much. That IT wasn't fancy, but it's better than sleeping outside with frogs that judge you. Every peasant's journey has a point where they are desperate and have to come up with new ideas. It is cold, The barn is full of angry cows, and the shrine has already been claimed by someone who snores loudly. What's left? The marketplace. During the day, medieval markets were a busy place where vendors shouted, animals moved around a lot. The cheese was not always very good, and there was sometimes pickpocketing. But at night, the town was empty. There were empty stalls and overturned carts. You might find half-eaten turnips if you looked. In other words, it's a great place to build. The wooden stalls were often just frames with thatched or cloth roofs, which were more decorative than weatherproof. But they did offer shelter from wind and rain, and if you didn't mind the smell of onions and old fish, and honestly, if you were a medieval peasant, you didn't. They were just right for a night's sleep. Just get on the counter, wrap up in whatever bag you were using as a coat, and try not to think about roast meat. There was also a strategic benefit. Markets were very important. They were near roads, churches, inns, and sometimes, if you were in a fancy town, a public toilet that only smelled a little bad. Sleeping there meant you would be awake in the morning, ready to go before the fishmongers arrived, carrying slabs of trout. Of course, there were risks. Some towns had night watchmen who did not like people sleeping without a license. If you get caught, you might get scolded, kicked awake, or even asked to explain yourself using complete sentences. And then there were the animals like stray dogs, rats, and geese. Don't underestimate medieval geese. They were loud, protective of their territory, and had a personal grudge against any animal that moved. Even so, it's better than sleeping in the mud. Sometimes, sellers would leave food like scraps or stale bread. This was too crusty for customers, but it was just right for someone who hadn't eaten anything solid since Tuesday. Market sheds weren't built for comfort, but they were useful. They were mostly dry, and best of all, they didn't ask questions. In medieval times, there was one kind of travel that slightly increased the chance of sleeping indoors. Pilgrimage. Imagine you were going to a place like Canterbury, Santiago, or some random saint's tomb in a remote place. Well done. You have just unlocked the only loyalty program for medieval travel. Pilgrim hostels, also called hospitia, xenodochia, or just a place that smells like sandalwood and feet, were religious guest houses specifically for the holy wanderer. These places were run by monks, nuns, or locals who wanted to be rewarded by God. They offered shelter, food, and the hope of not dying in a ditch. All you needed was a pilgrim's badge, a small symbol that showed you were walking for Jesus, not just running away from your landlord. These badges were like the medieval version of backstage passes. Wear one, and you might find that door's open for you. If you forget one, you're just another homeless person with sore feet and a shady look in your eye. The hostel had different types of rooms. You might get a straw mattress, a wool blanket, or if you're really lucky, a shared bed in a cold room upstairs. The team kept a clean sheet and enjoyed some privacy. That's for nobles and heretics. It was warm and dry, and the food, which was often just soup with vegetables, was quite cheap. Monks were usually the hosts, which meant a few things. Pray at sunrise and no talking at dinner. Pilgrims were expected to behave like saints, even if they smelled bad. If you were caught stealing, lying, or flirting too much with the icon of St. Cuthbert, you'd be out faster than someone who doesn't believe in God at a bonfire. But for the tired and poor, pilgrim hostels were a blessing. They were one of the few places you could count on some safety and care. They were like little safe havens on the bumpy road of medieval chaos. What do we learn? If you had sore feet, were feeling spiritual, and had a convincing story about a vision involving the Virgin Mary and 3 geese, you could rest easy, at least for one night. The medieval noble estate, home to fine tapestries, roast swan, and secret plots against the nobles, and a backyard full of peasants trying to sleep discreetly next to the manure heap. Yes, for the particularly adventurous traveler, noble lands offered opportunity, so long as you understood your place and that place was very much behind the stables. You weren't just walking up to the castle and asking for a room. That sort of thing got you crossbowed. But noble estates were very big. Manor houses, fields, storehouses, livestock pens, and most importantly, outbuildings. The stables, granaries, sheds, and tool sheds provided shelter, warmth, and, if you were lucky, a goat that didn't mind having company. If you had a good reason for being there, and you were lucky enough to meet a kind steward, you might be allowed to stay for a short time. Nobles like to show that they are religious, and one way they do this is by helping poor people. But let's be honest, most ordinary people didn't ask for it. They looked scared. They would find a low wall, a patch of dry grass, or the shadow of a building, and curl up like a hedgehog who feels guilty. Behind the stables was a favorite. It was warm and cozy, and it was protected from the wind. Also, nobody wanted to spend time near the horse rings at night anyway. Instant privacy. There were a lot of risks, of course. If a guard saw you, you might be chased away or beaten up depending on how bored he was. If the noble was really worried about being seen, you might be accused of being a poacher, a thief, or just too scruffy to be allowed to stay. If the animals didn't like you, being kicked by a medieval donkey would teach you a lot. But for the desperate noble, the lands were tempting. They had resources, fences, and a tendency to leave things lying around unsupervised. Don't touch the apples, the pigs, or the fence. Make yourself invisible, stay quiet, and leave before sunrise. A nobleman's breakfast is always ruined if you find a peasant asleep behind the compost pile. In the medieval game, where can I sleep without dying or paying? Abandoned buildings were the best. Yes, they were falling apart, full of rats, and probably cursed too. But did we mention they were free? The beauty of an abandoned cottage, burnout smithy, or ruined mill was that nobody cared about them. Nobles didn't send guards after you. Monks weren't expecting you to pray, and the people who ran the pubs weren't charging you for a bowl of gruel. If you could ignore the big holes in the roof and the strange noises you could hear when the wind blew through the rafters, you would be in a good position. These structures were often left over from a time that was better, or at least less full of plague. A village that was left behind during the Black Death. It's a ghost town. The watchtower was no longer needed because the invaders got bored. It is empty and beautiful. That old bathhouse that burned down after someone lit a candle near the oils. It smelled a bit strange, but it was only 4 walls of 4 walls. The peasants didn't ask questions. They saw a roof, a door, and floor space. It's full of rats, but there's still space. You put some straw in a corner. You might have used your bag as a pillow and hoped that the spirit of the peasant who died there before you was feeling generous. Medieval superstition made things even worse. Everyone knew that abandoned places were haunted. That's why they were left behind. The sound of a wail. It must be a ghost. It feels cold and it's a bit windy. Ghost. A creepy goat is staring through the window at 3 a.m. It might be a ghost, but it might just be a goat. Most likely. But if you were poor and traveling, haunted buildings were often safer than sleeping outside. They offered shelter from the rain, wind, wolves, and sometimes other people. They also sometimes came with tools, food, or firewood that had been left behind by people who had previously lived there. You didn't brag about staying in these places. You didn't look at them in the light of day. But when night fell and you were cold, alone, and one sore ankle away from collapsing, an abandoned hovel was a gift from the gods, or at least from someone who wasn't coming back. In the Middle Ages, life was hard. There was a lot of hunger and disease, but there were also some kind people. But every so often, a peasant traveler did win the lottery and met someone who wasn't a nasty person. These people were all different. There was an old widow who remembered what it was like to be poor, a tired farmer who had an extra crust of bread and a half in the barn, and a religious merchant who really believed in the words of the Bible. Whatever the reason, they saw a stranger, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Okay, you can sleep near the pig. Sleep." No one expected a feather bed or a roasted goose, but a roof, a fire, and something to eat? That was a real miracle in medieval times. In return, the peasant would usually offer to chop wood, fetch water, or pretend to understand the host's complaints about the tax collector. But not every kind stranger was purely selfless. Sometimes being kind meant asking for something. Look after the children, drive off wolves, and help fix a wheelbarrow that was last used during the Crusades. But it was still a fair trade compared to being mugged by bandits or eaten by wild dogs. The problem was that not every friendly-looking stranger was who they said they were. There were scams, traps, and sometimes the people who let you stay would accidentally forget to mention that there were lice until you'd already started scratching. But that was just the risk of the road. Word of mouth helped. Villagers whispered names of good people. Old Martyr is near the river. Brother Anelm is in the valley 2 valleys over. That strange shepherd who likes travelers and sheep. These weren't enemies. They were small signs of hope, found here and there. Sometimes, if a traveler was really desperate, they would find a fire, a bowl of stew, and a friendly smile. In a world where nobody trusted anyone, that meant everything. Just don't stay there for too long. Even kindness had a time limit. Let's be clear about one thing. When we say poor peasants slept with animals, we mean they were close to them, not that they were in love. This isn't 50 Shades of Hay. It's about survival. It was cold and damp, and the air was full of noise. When winter came, and the only thing between you and freezing was a pig named Marjorie, you cuddled up and tried not to think about the smell. Animals were like medieval central heating. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs all emitted a warm, radiating glow like the warmth of a large radiator that occasionally tried to eat your bedding. In many peasant homes, especially those that had space for animals, there wasn't much of a separation between the living area and the barn. The pig would have its own corner, you would have the other corner, and the chicken would wander wherever it wanted because no one had the energy to argue with it. When they were traveling, it was no different. Sleep near an ox cart, you've got wind protection and 2,000 pounds of body heat. Look for a farm next to the road and ask the farmer if you can come in. That's a really nice place to stay compared to sleeping outside under a tree with nothing but a wet sock and a grudge. Even a windy goat shed is better than shivering alone in the woods. Unless the goat was protecting its territory. Some were. You learned that the hard way. There are some problems, of course. You might get lice or fleas, and it might be bad smells. You might hear noises at midnight that make you question your life choices. But in the peasant economy, beggars couldn't be sniffy. If you could avoid going into the cow's personal space and getting kicked, it would be a surprisingly effective survival strategy. You even bonded with the animals sometimes. That sheep that didn't trample your foot, she was your new best friend. The donkey that didn't bite you when you leaned on it for warmth. It was practically your family. The pig that tolerated your snoring but let you stay was a saint. It wasn't just common for people to sleep with animals. It was clever, practical, and in many ways, more reliable than humans. Animals didn't judge your patched tunic, ask invasive questions, or demand coins you didn't have. They just existed, snorted, and kept you warm, which in the grand medieval scheme of things made them excellent roommates. You did it. You walked through mud, slept next to goats, asked strangers for food, got sneezed on by monks, and maybe didn't get robbed every night. Well done. Now you get to do it all over again, but in reverse. The return journey for a poor peasant wasn't a happy one. It was more like going back and fixing the mistakes you made, but now you were a bit more thirsty and had a lot more lice. You weren't just tired. You felt totally worn out in body and mind, but you were still wiser. Not in the way people think nobles are wise after reading Cicero, by a fire. No, you were a peasant. You knew which barns had the softest hay, which roadside shrines didn't smell of goat urine, and which taverns had owners who didn't water down the ale too much. You even had a mental map of which dogs bite and which just bark. You had also changed what you were expecting. Before you were optimistic enough to think someone might offer you a bed, you saw a dry ditch and thought, luxury? That soggy loaf of bread you swapped for your last wooden spoon. This is the best deal I've found all week. And that monk who gave you some soup and spent 45 minutes telling you all about sin. At least it was warm. The most difficult part was knowing that no one back home would believe a word of it. Oh, of course, they'd say you slept in a churchyard, ate beetroot soup with nuns, and avoided a plague outbreak by hiding under a broken wagon. Right. But in your heart, full of lice bites and blisters, you knew you had made it through the medieval road. You had to deal with hunger, cold, and awkward silences with donkeys. You had made it through the medieval hospitality lottery and lived to tell the tale. You would probably wait until after a bath, but the journey changed you. Your tunic was torn, your dignity slightly damaged, and your feet. It's best not to talk about your feet, but your outlook on life was wider. You knew how kind strangers could be, how useful goats could be, and how sleeping in places you swore you'd never mention again could make you feel spiritual. You left as a simple country person. You came back as a peasant, but now you have stories to tell. And that's something. In Tudor England, fashion was more than just fabric stitched together. It was a bold statement, like a social contract that you could wear on your body. Every rough, jeweled gown and carefully chosen sleeve was a statement about wealth, power, and a social class. What you wear says more than what you say. Clothes are a way of communicating. The Tudor world was one where appearances mattered a lot. The monarchy was always keen to keep order, and so they made sure that fashion became a way of communicating things that was strictly controlled. The government made people follow these laws. They said exactly what people from each class could and couldn't wear. These rules were not just suggestions. They were legal instructions. Velvet was something that nobles wore. If a normal shopkeeper dared to wear such luxurious fabric, he risked being fined or even shamed in public. Purple dye was rare and expensive, so it was used only by royalty, while gold embroidery was used to mark the highest ranks of society. Even furs were given a rank, with man and sable being worn by nobles, while lower classes were limited to rabbit or fox. The way you dress or the sparkle of your jewelry might show if you were living beyond your means or just pretending to be. For the Tudors, clothing was also a way of showing loyalty. If they dressed in a way that the crown approved, it was a sign that they accepted the social order in England. A courtier in King Henry VIII court looked like a walking jewel box. His slashed sleeves revealed glimpses of rich silks beneath, while his codpiece showed that he was both powerful and confident. At the same time, ordinary people walked through muddy fields wearing rough, woolly clothes that were practical but plain. The divide between the classes was obvious. But it wasn't just about the law. It was about survival. If someone makes a mistake in their outfit, people might think they are arrogant or rebellious. Wearing silk when you weren't allowed to suggested that you were trying to act higher than you were, which was dangerous in a kingdom where the king was in charge. In this sense, fashion was a silent performance of obedience. If you followed the code, you could keep your place. If you broke it, you would be in big trouble. At that time, Tudor clothing was not just about looking good. It was about living carefully in a world where even fabric had a political meaning. If there was one piece of clothing that screamed Tudia, it was the ruff. At first, it was just a small decoration on the collar, a frame for the face. But like so many fashions born in Tudor England, it grew bigger, bolder, and more absurd with each passing decade. By the time Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne, these elaborate hairstyles had become a symbol of status, often featuring intricate details like ribbons and bows. Making a proper ruff was no easy task. Each one needed fine linen, which was often imported, and this was then carefully ironed and folded into a perfect series of loops. The stiffer the ruff, the more fashionable it was. Some were edged with delicate lace, while others were embroidered with gold or silver thread. And they weren't just for women. Men also liked the ruff, turning their heads into floating discs of wealth and vanity. At court, the size of your ruff said as much about your ambition as your words ever could. But the ruff was more than just decoration. It was a way of showing that someone was important. These collars were so impractical that only the rich could afford them. After all, how could a farmer plow a field while wearing a collar wide enough to block his peripheral vision? The court was designed to separate the rich from the poor, to make it physically impossible for the elite to stoop, sweat, or work. It was like shouting, "I don't work with my hands. I pay others to do that." Ruffs also needed a lot of maintenance. Servants had to wash, starch, and iron them with heated poking sticks to keep the folds neat. If a person's skin was wrinkly or saggy, it was seen as a sign of laziness or poverty. This meant that the ruff acted like a social trap. Once you started following this style, you had to keep investing in it, or you might get embarrassed. But there was also something beautiful about it. Ruffs framed faces like portraits, drawing attention to powdered skin and jeweled earrings. They were a symbol of the Tudor ruler's love of order and of showing off. Each fold is the same, and each crease is intentional. In the world of fashion, where looks mattered, the ruff was the perfect metaphor. It's uncomfortable, expensive, and you'll never forget it. The Tudors were known for their eccentric fashions, and few were as flamboyant or as revealing as the slash sleeve. At first, you might think that someone has ruined their doublet, a piece of clothing, in a fit of rage, leaving it tattered and ruined. But actually, this was a style that had been carefully planned. The outer fabric had been cut into a pattern to reveal a more luxurious layer underneath. This idea started on the battlefields of continental Europe. There, soldiers didn't have enough proper clothes, so they cut up their old clothes to make space for captured silks and bright fabrics. What started out as a practical improvisation quickly became a fashion trend. In Tudor England, slashing was a way of life. Noblemen walked around with their sleeves cut into patterns. Through these sleeves, bright silk or velvet could be seen. It was like a play, with fabric being used as if it were a theater. The slash sleeve also had a special meaning. It was a way of showing off how rich someone was. It was made from two expensive fabrics, and one of them was cut up to make the other one look even better. In a world that was obsessed with hierarchy, destroying valuable cloth to make a point was the height of extravagance. Only the rich could show off like that. And, as always, the rules about what fabrics people could wear and how they could cut them were decided by the rich and powerful. If a peasant copied this, they might get fined or even mocked as a pretender. For women, slashing was just as detailed. The gowns had open sleeves or bodices, showing the wearer's undergarments underneath. When combined with embroidery, jewels, and flowing ribbons, a woman's dress became a layered mix of colors and textures designed to look stunning. The effect was both playful and powerful, allowing wearers to draw attention to themselves. What was revealed and what remained hidden became a kind of controlled seduction. But it was not very practical. Clothes that had been cut into slits easily caught on things, needed constant repair, and had to be arranged by a skilled tailor. But it was never about being practical. The Tudor dress was made to show off how rich and well-dressed a woman was. The fashion was deliberately uncomfortable and difficult because ease was the privilege of the worker. The courtier's job was to impress, not to work hard. Slash sleeves were more than just a fashion statement. They were a symbol of the way of life in Tudor times. It It was a time of surface brilliance, where people carefully planned how they would be seen by others. There was always a tension between what was shown and what was hidden. The rough fabric framed the face and slashed sleeves, drawing the eye. The jeweled gown, however, was the full display of Tuda's wealth. These gowns were more than just clothes. They were walking treasuries, heavy with gemstones, pearls, embroidery, and precious metals stitched directly into the fabric. For Tuda women at court, especially queens and noble ladies, a gown was less about comfort and more about making a statement the moment they entered a room. It showed their power, prestige, and divine favor. Take in Berlin, for example. She understood the power of clothes better than most. She amazed Henry VIII with her French-style gowns, which were full of detail and very fancy. Elizabeth I, her daughter, made this even better. The Virgin Queen wore gowns covered in pearls. Foreign ambassadors said she looked like a vision of light. Pearls were a symbol of purity, which was a message that was especially important for a queen who called herself England's eternal maiden. Each jewel was a tool of propaganda, woven not only into the fabric, but also into the minds of all who looked at her. But the extravagance was more than just a symbol. It was also very scary. Jeweled gowns were very expensive because they needed fine materials like velvet or satin, and the embroidery needed gold and silver thread. A lot of people worked together to make a dress. Some gowns were so heavy with decorations that the person wearing them could hardly move without help. This stiffness made them look even better. Queens and noble women moved slowly and deliberately. This was not just because of the ceremony, but also because their heavy clothing made it difficult to move quickly. These gowns also showed the big differences between classes. While rich people wore fancy clothes, normal women wore simple wool or linen. The jewel gown made it clear that the elite were a different class, wearing clothes made of materials that most people would never have access to. And like all things Tuda, there were rules. Some stones and fabrics were only worn by royalty and the highest nobility. If a woman dressed in a way that suggested she was too confident or too ambitious, people might think badly of her. The jeweled gown was more than just a fashion statement. It was a political weapon used by Tuda. It made people think they had unstoppable power. When Elizabeth I appeared wearing pearls and rubies, she was not simply dressed. She was calling herself the living embodiment of England, a queen whose clothes showed that she was both divine and earthly. Not many clothes in history show a strange mix of boldness, uncertainty, and attention-grabbing as the codpiece. In Tudor England, this strange addition to men's clothing became the ultimate symbol of masculinity, wealth, and quite frankly, cruelty. What started as a simple piece of fabric to cover the gap between a man's hose quickly changed into something much more. It became a big pouch, padded, and sometimes even jeweled, that made a man's groin the most important part of his outfit. The codpiece first appeared in the late 15th century, when men's hose were so tight that they showed off a lot of private parts. A small triangular piece of cloth was added to cover the gap. But as the Tudors started to wear clothes that made a statement, this simple cover grew, swelled, and ballooned until it was impossible to ignore. By the time of Henry VIII, codpieces had become very big. Some were stuffed with fabric, others had wire in them, and the most fancy ones were decorated with embroidery, ribbons, or even jewels. A king or nobleman might walk into court looking very fancy, only to have everyone look at the bulge in his clothing that shows he is a man of great sexual energy. Henry VIII found the codpiece particularly useful. When he was younger, this made him look strong and healthy. Later, as he got older and sicker, the codpiece became almost like a symbol of strength and health, even though he was losing those things. There were even rumors that Henry used his codpiece to hide medical dressings, making it both a practical and daring choice. The codpiece was an important part of his image as a king who was the perfect example of a man. After Henry, the codpiece was used to show a person's status in society. A codpiece, a piece of armor worn over the groin, that was well padded and richly decorated, showed that the person wore it to show off their wealth. You could afford smart clothes and having fun showing off. For soldiers, it was connected to ideas of being strong and brave. In portraits, commanders posed with codpieces as big as their swords, showing a link between military strength and sexual control. But, as with many fashion trends, the codpiece was eventually seen to be ridiculous. By the time Queen Elizabeth I was in power, the style had almost disappeared, replaced by a more simple and modest look. But for a few decades, the codpiece was the most daring example of Tudor display. This showed that even masculinity itself could be exaggerated, padded, and put on display. In Tudor England, color was never just for show. It was meant to be. Every color had its own message. Every shade of the color spoke to the status, loyalty, or morality of the person wearing it. The dyes that made Tudor fashion possible were expensive, took a lot of work to apply, and were often imported from far away. The color you wore told other people about your place in the social order. If you wore a color that was higher than your rank, people might suspect you of trying to get around the rules about what you could wear. The most popular color was purple, but it was so expensive to make that most people couldn't buy it. The dyes came from rare types of shellfish that were imported from the Mediterranean. A single ounce of dye required thousands of shellfish. When Henry VIII or Elizabeth I wore purple, it wasn't just because they liked the color. It was a way of saying that they were chosen to rule. Just to let you know, they were the only ones allowed to sound majestic in that way. Crimson and scarlet followed closely behind. They were made using cochineal from Spanish colonies and kermes from the Mediterranean, and these deep reds were the colors of nobility, power, and ambition. The rich and powerful wore scarlet velvet gowns, while deep crimson cloaks showed their status and wealth. Black, though seemingly serious, was also powerful. To get it deep, uniform black, they had to apply lots of expensive dye, so it was a luxury color. In Tudor England, wearing black was a way to show dignity, seriousness, and wealth. It was no coincidence that portraits of Elizabeth I often showed her wearing black, with pearls sewn into the fabric. This made her look both calm and bright. For the lower classes, colors were much more subtle. Browns, grays, and dull greens were common for everyday wear and were dyed with cheaper local plants. These clothes were practical, hiding dirt and wear, but they also made it very obvious that peasants and nobles looked very different. If you saw a noble dressed in bright red or gold, it made you think of a world you could never reach. But color was about more than just class. It was also about symbolism. Green was connected to the idea of fertility and youth. Blue was linked to the Virgin Mary, a symbol of religious devotion. Gold was a sign of wealth and divine favor. Wearing it was like speaking the language of heaven. In the world of Tudor, color was very important. If you wore it boldly, people would notice you. If you were refused something, it was a reminder of your place. Every thread, every shade, and every dye was another part of the complicated conversation about power and identity that was so important in that time. If color was the language of Tudor's status, fabric was its accent. In Tudor England, the fabric of your clothing revealed a lot about your wealth, your social class, and even your moral character. The rich fabrics and bright colors were just as important as the expensive materials. The nobles wore clothes made from rare and costly materials, and a single gown could cost as much as a peasant's home. The most important of these was silk, which was imported from Italy, France, and the Far East. It was shiny, which made it stand out, and it quickly became a fabric that only the rich could buy. Worn on its own or under cut-out sleeves, silk shone in candlelight and sunlight, making the wearer glow in royal halls. Velvet followed close behind. It was thick and plush, a fabric that looked and felt luxurious. Velvet in deep red or green was a common item in the wardrobes of the nobles, and its very high price meant that it was out of reach for the lower ranks. The satin and damask made it even more luxurious. Damask, with its detailed patterns woven directly into the fabric, made gowns and doublets look and feel richer and more textured. Satin has a shiny surface that feels smooth and almost like water. These were not materials meant for the hard work of daily life. They were just for looking at. It looked like they had a good job. Fur also had an important role. A tuta gown lined with sable or lynx fur showed that the person wearing it was very important. Lesser furs, such as fox, rabbit, or lamb, were considered suitable for those in the lower ranks. Fur kept you warm, but more importantly, it showed who was in charge. Henry VIII loved fur and often appeared in portraits wearing thick, fur-lined robes that made him look larger than life. Even linen and wool, which were more common, were carefully graded. The best linen, made as white as possible, was used to make shirts and smocks that fitted close to the body. These clothes were used to show off jewels and embroidery. Normal people wore coarse wool in natural colors. This wool was strong and practical. But among nobles, even wool could be transformed, dyed in bright colors, and woven into fine cloth. The look of tuta fashion was always planned. Rough against smooth, matte against glossy. These contrasts made a big visual impact, showing off wealth in a flashy way. In a society where how people look is important, fabric itself became a tool of power. The tuta elite did not just wear clothes. They made use of texture, adding their authority to every stitch. In Tudor England, no outfit was complete without the finishing touches. Accessories were not afterthoughts. They were very important statements about what they liked, how much money they had, and who they were. If a nobleman or lady stepped into the court, they would always look their best. Every hat, feather, jewel, and shoe buckle made the performance more impressive. Hats were especially important for men. The flat cap or bonnet, often decorated with feathers and jewels, was the typical hat worn at court. These hats could be simple or very fancy, depending on the person's rank. Henry VIII was rarely seen without a big hat full of gems. For women, hoods are the most popular accessory. The French hood introduced by and Berlin framed the face with a rounded edge, showing a little bit of hair. Catherine of Aragon's gabled hood is a triangle, which is similar to the roof lines of tuta houses. Each choice was political as well as personal. If a woman wore one hood, it showed that she was part of a certain group or fashion trend. Jewelry was worn for two reasons: to make a person look good and to show who they were. Pearl necklaces and gold chains were draped across gowns. Rings sparkled on every finger, and jeweled belts were tied around the waist. For Elizabeth I, pearls became her symbol. They showed that she was pure and made people think of her as the Virgin Queen. People who wanted to impress others followed this example, wearing jewelry made of gemstones even when they had no money. If a person didn't wear jewelry at the royal court, it was seen as a sign that they didn't have any power. Shoes might seem like an afterthought, but in tuta fashion, even shoes had meaning. Men's shoes, known as duckbill shoes, were flat, wide, and often stuffed to make their shape look bigger. Some were cut like sleeves, showing off the rich fabrics underneath. Women's shoes were often hidden under long gowns, but they were still made from nice materials like leather, velvet, or silk. Both men and women sometimes wore slippers with gold thread embroidery indoors. The rich also had patterns. They had wooden platforms worn under their shoes to lift them above the mud. This was a practical necessity in a world where streets also doubled as sewers. Accessories were more than just for looks. They were very powerful. A noble's wealth was shown not just by the land or titles he owned, but also by the shiny things he wore, like his hat pin or his wife's girdle. In Tudor times, when looks were very important, accessories were the most valuable thing of all, the body itself. Tudor clothing was never just about covering the body. It was a carefully created image of who they were, their power, and what they stood for. When you put on a Tudor gown or doublet, you were stepping into a role that was dictated not only by personal taste, but also by the crown itself. Every piece of clothing, every jewel, every puff sleeve was part of script that defined who you were allowed to be in the strict social order of Tudor England. For the monarch, fashion was a stage. Henry VIII's big fur-lined coats and huge codpieces showed that he was powerful, strong, and rich. As Elizabeth I aged and became unwell, she started to change the way she dressed to make herself look more attractive. She wore pearls, suns, and special patterns on her clothes to make people see her not just as a queen, but as a living icon. She also used her clothes to do politics. She knew that one appearance could make her and all her subjects more believable than any speech. For the nobility, clothing became both a sign of privilege and a way of life. They wore jewels and velvet, but these things cost a lot of money. Families spent all their money to look well dressed at the court, because if they looked poor, they would be ignored. In politics, fashion was as important for survival as it was for beauty. It brought together allies, created divisions between groups, and allowed ambitious people to show their loyalty or superiority by wearing different types of clothing. For ordinary people, the symbolism was more serious. Their plain clothes made them stand out from the crowd. They were reminded every day that color, fabric, and excess were things that only other people had. Clothing made it clear who was in charge and who wasn't, and made it impossible for people to ignore the differences between them. But the impact of Tudor fashion is still felt today, long after the 19th century. Today, images of a Tudor ruff or a jeweled gown immediately bring to mind the grandeur and excess of that time. Fashion historians think that these clothes are beautiful, but they also see them as political, ambitious, and propaganda. In many ways, Tudor fashion was like a sign of things to come, showing that people in the future would be obsessed with image. Clothes would still be a way for people to show their status, values, and identity. In the end, Tudor fashion was more than just a personal preference. It was the clear sign of power itself. Dressing like a Tudor was like being part of a big show. In this show, fabric and thread were more important than words, and your identity was shown through your clothes. Going into a medieval Arab market was like entering the heart of the city. Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus were not just known for their mosques, palaces, or schools. They were full of life in the big markets, where you could feel the energy all around you. The bazaar was more than just a place to buy and sell things. It was the place where people's lives happened, where money was made, where people got known, and where news spread quickly. From sunrise to sunset, the streets were full of people. Tents and wooden awnings stretched overhead, providing shade for shoppers from the intense sun, while narrow lanes wound in twisting paths that seemed endless. The air smelt of saffron and cardamom from India, frankincense from Arabia, musk from Central Asia, and the ever-present perfume of roasting lamb and bread fresh from clay ovens. In one alley, you might hear the sound of a blacksmith hammering metal. Next, the soft sound of silks being unfolded for people to buy. The marketplace was full of people talking. Merchants shouted about their products, promising that their spices were fresher their fabrics better, and their prices cheaper than the man in the next stall. Haggling was not only expected, but also celebrated. It was a way of connecting buyers and sellers, where both parties showed their wit and patience. Paying the first price offered showed that they were inexperienced and even ashamed. But business was only one part of the story. The bazaar was also the place where people talked about what was going on in the city. News of wars far away, plots in the royal court, or the latest scandal in the governor's palace spread quickly there. People traveling on pilgrimages and trading brought stories from places as far as Andalusia and Samarkand, which made the market a place where different cultures met. Here, a scholar might debate religion next to a butcher's stall, while a poet recites verses to a crowd of people. For ordinary people, the bazaar was the heart of community life. It was a place where a father might choose his daughter's wedding dress, where a mother brought her children to eat sweet honey cakes, and where neighbors shared news over cups of coffee or tea. In these busy streets, the city's character was shaped not by monuments or documents, but by the exchange of goods, the buzz of conversation, and the connections made by its people. If the medieval-era bazaar had a signature, it was its smell. Walking through its winding streets meant being surrounded by the wonderful smell of the area. Each one is a thread that links the city to lands far beyond its walls. Spices and perfumes were more than just things you bought and sold. There were things that people wanted, medicines, ways to show status, and sometimes ways to help make deals between countries. The stalls were full of baskets of saffron, and the golden threads were worth a lot of money. The merchants who sold it protected it carefully, as if it were a precious jewel. Cinnamon and cloves came from India and the Indonesian Isles. They were taken to other countries on camelback and boat across seas and deserts. Black pepper, which is so commonplace today, was then a luxury spice, a prized seasoning for elite households. Cardamom pods, nutmeg, and ginger were stacked in neat piles, and their strong smells filled the air long before the customer reached the store. People who sold perfume made this sensory experience even more interesting. In their shops, there were shelves made of wood. On these shelves, there were bottles filled with things like rose water from Persia, musk from Tibet, amber resin brought back by sailors from the Indian Ocean, and frankincense harvested in Arabia. Perfume was more than just something to make you smell nice. They were very important in religious rituals, royal life, and medicine. Doctors prescribed them to balance body fluids, while nobles used them to show their status. The Prophet Muhammad himself had praised perfume. In medieval Islamic society, scent was seen as a sign of cleanliness, religious devotion, and sophistication. Every purchase was of high quality. Sellers invited customers to try saffron, which has a strong flavor, or to rub a drop of oil on their skin. They told stories about where they came from, saying they were from the mountains of Yemen or the ships of Gujarat. Sometimes they even made it up. In the market, storytelling was as important as the products they were selling. Buyers argued about not only the price, but also the prestige of the purchase. If you walk home with a pouch of imported cinnamon, it was a sign that you were wealthy, just as much as it was a sign that you had food. But spices and perfumes were more than just luxuries. They were a connection between worlds. Every time he breathed in, he remembered that Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus were not just any ordinary cities. They were important trading centers for the entire region. The story was about strange things like caravans crossing deserts, ships sailing in monsoon winds, and merchants creating a network that stretched from China to Andalusia. In this economy, where things were sold to make money, the business was not just local. It was a global event, with people from half the world there. Spices made the market smell good, and textiles made it look colorful. The markets of Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus were filled with fabric. Rolls of silk shine like liquid light, carpets spread across the ground like woven gardens, and stacks of cotton are filled with every color you can imagine. In a society where clothes showed your position, wealth, and personality, textiles were more than just things you bought and sold. They were powerful symbols of who you were. Silk, the most popular, came from China and Central Asia via the Silk Road, as well as from looms in Byzantine and Persia. The fabric felt luxurious to the touch, smooth, shimmering, and much finer than coarse wool or linen. In the bazaar, merchants would spread their silks out for buyers to see, making them look beautiful in the sunlight. Wealthy families bought it for special occasions. Nobles put it on cushions and curtains, and rulers gave it to foreign ambassadors to show how important they were. Another treasure was the carpets. They came from Persia, Anatolia, and even local workshops. Carpets were both practical and beautiful, with patterns full of shapes, flowers, and important symbols. A carpet was not just something to walk on. It was a place for prayer, a status symbol, and a family heirloom. In mosques, carpets make the floor feel nice and soft for people when they're worshiping. In homes, they decorated walls and floors. People who wanted to buy a carpet would look closely at the knots and colors. A good carpet could last for many years and be sold for a lot of money. Cotton and wool, though cheaper, were just as important. Egypt exported high-quality cotton that was dyed in bright blues and reds. Ordinary people bought strong materials like wool or linen for everyday clothes, while merchants bought large amounts of these goods to sell in other countries. Deer's quarters were filled with vats of indigo, madder and saffron. These stains gave the fabrics brilliant shades of color, transforming the bazaar into a festival of color. Every transaction was a kind of ritual. Buyers would tug at the fabric to see if it was strong, hold it up to the light to see if it was good quality, and always argue strongly about the price. Sellers responded by boasting about where they got their items. We have knots and tools from Persia and Damascus. People knew that the history of a piece of fabric was as important as the fabric itself. Looking around the stalls was like seeing a display of wealth and ambition. Here, fabric was more than just a material. It was about memory, status, and connection. Each thread connected the bazaar to the rest of the world, bringing together China, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean into one big, colorful picture. If the medieval market was a sight to behold and a treat for the senses, it was also very loud. The market was a busy place with a constant mix of people, music, and stories, all adding to the daily life of the city. Going into the bazaar was like being surrounded by a sound that had its own meaning. The merchants are the ones shouting the loudest. They shouted their wares with a regular rhythm, and their chants were meant to be heard over the noise. Fresh figs, sweet dates, best prices in Cairo was the message on the sign of the spice seller, who was loudly talking about saffron from faraway lands. People were arguing about the price. People buying and selling things were arguing playfully. Both parties knew that the bargaining process was just half of the transaction. People started to shout, then they laughed. When they finally agreed, they shook hands and sometimes said a prayer. May God bring you success. But the business was not just about making money. Between stalls, musicians played lots of instruments, including flutes and drums. Their melodies drifted through the crowd like invisible threads. Some of them were professionals who were hired by coffee shop owners to attract more customers. Others were wandering minstrels who lived from one performance to the next. Their songs tell stories of heroes, lovers, and saints. The drumming and the sound of the book drum made shopping into a show. Storytellers added another layer. Men would gather in shaded courtyards or near the entrances of mosques. There, they listened to stories told by Hakawati narrators. These narrators would spin tales of adventure, like the stories of Antar, or episode from the ever-expanding 1001 Nights. Crowds listened intently as the voices rose and fell, punctuated by gasps, chuckles, or cheers. These stories were more than just a way to pass the time. They taught people about right and wrong, kept memories of the past alive, and shared news by telling stories. The sounds of animals added to the noise. Donkeys were tied up, and their hair was braided as they were used to carry sacks of grain. Camels groaned under the heavy carpets, and the cries of water sellers echoed through the lanes. Cold water, fresh water. Children ran between stalls, laughing and shouting. The sounds of blacksmiths and wood carvers added to the noise. The businesses' sounds were not random, but were signs of activity. Every voice, every instrument, every animal call was part of a bigger harmony. It was a lively concert where trade, art, and community came together, reminding everyone that the bazaar was more than just a market. It was the beating heart of the city. The medieval-era bazaar was not only a place where people did business, it was also a place where politics happened. Merchants shouted, and there was a strong smell of spices. But behind them, there was a hidden system of government, taxes, and control. The rulers understood that whoever controlled the market controlled the city's economy. All the stalls and all the caravans of goods that entered the gates had to pay taxes. The Sultan or Caliph chose officials to patrol the markets. These officials made sure that taxes were paid on all goods, from silk to sesame seeds. These taxes paid for the army, the mosques, and public works, making the bazaar a treasury as well as a marketplace. The mutes, or market inspector, was a particularly feared figure. His job was to make sure trade was fair, check the weights and measures of merchants, and punish fraud. If the butcher's scales were found to be tampered with, the mtasib could close his shop or even order him to be whipped. Justice was public and quick to reassure customers that the bazaar was safe from exploitation. But the bazaar was also a place where politics and intrigue were common. Here, gossip spread quickly. Merchants traded not only goods, but also information. News of military campaigns, rumors of court scandals, and rumors about who will inherit the throne. Sultans and governors often had informants in the markets. These informants would listen for any signs of unrest. They would disguise themselves as normal customers. If someone made a joke about taxes or complained about the ruler, it could get back to the palace by the evening. The bazaar was also a place where people could show off their power. Rulers and governors often started or finished their processions there, which made the people remember them. Edicts were read out loud in the market square, making sure that as many people as possible could hear them. In times of crisis, such as famine or war, rulers might appear personally to order the fair distribution of grain, knowing that the bazaar was where their decisions were most visible. At the same time, the market gave power to ordinary people. If enough people stopped buying from a dishonest shopkeeper, or if enough people complained about taxes, this could eventually lead to real political action. Leaders ignored the mood of the bazaar at their peril, because it was there that the pulse of the city could be felt most strongly. So, the bazaar was more than just a place to buy and sell things. It was a place where rulers and the people met to discuss power. Taxes added money to the government's coffers, spies gathered information, and politics mixed with trade as easily as perfume mixed with the air. In the medieval-era bazaar, religion and daily life were closely connected. It was a part of every lane, every shop, every transaction. Unlike modern markets, where commerce and religion are often separate, the bazaar was located close to mosques, madrasas, and shrines. This meant that people practiced their faith not only in these sacred buildings, but also in everyday life. It was lived openly in the middle of the marketplace. The call to prayer was the heartbeat of the bazaar. The muezz's voice could be heard 5 times a day, coming from minuets and rising above the noise of people bargaining and hooves clattering. Shopkeepers quickly closed the curtains over their stalls. Customers stopped arguing and went to pray. Markets in Cairo might be quiet, except for the sound of sandals on stone, before they come back to life with new energy after prayer. Charity was also a key part of bazaar culture. Merchants were expected not only to sell, but to give. Some of the profits were often given as zakat, alms that were required by Islamic law, or as voluntary donations. In some markets, there were water fountains and public kitchens. These were paid for by donations. A man called Wax stood at the entrances of these kitchens. He made sure that poor people and travelers did not go thirsty or hungry. If you refused to be generous, you might be punished by God and people. The way goods were handled was influenced by the idea of ritual purity. Butchers followed Islamic rules of slaughter, and market inspectors made sure that food was prepared according to religious standards. Perfume sellers would talk about hadiths that praised cleanliness. At the same time, scribes would often copy Quranic verses and sell them alongside poetry. Faith was even a part of business. Contracts and receipts might open with the words, "In the name of God," reminding the buyer and seller that every transaction was a moral one. Religious festivals turned the market into a place of celebration. During Ramadan, markets were lit up with lanterns. Sweet sellers displayed trays of honey cakes, and nights were filled with music after the fast. People were busy at the markets, buying new clothes, perfumes, and gifts. Their happiness fills the streets, which are already decorated with banners and lights. The bazaar was about more than just goods. It was about the spirit of the city. Here, people were devoted to their religion and also liked shopping. They prayed and bargained and were kind to each other. In the medieval Arab world, shopping was also a way of showing off one's faith. People did this by going to markets where they would see other people who believed the same things they did. The medieval Arab bazaar was more than just a marketplace. It was a place where different cultures met. Not many other places in the world have such a mix of different people, languages, and traditions. Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus were important trading cities, and their markets showed this. If you walked through them, you would see half the known world in just one afternoon. Foreign merchants were common sights. Persian traders, wearing loose robes, sold carpets and metal goods. Merchants from India unloaded spices, precious stones, and cotton. Greek and Italian traders sold glassware, wine, and fine fabrics. The African interior supplied ivory, gold, and slaves, while caravans from Central Asia brought horses, furs, and exotic birds. Each group spoke its own language, but Arabic was the main language used for business, which made it easy for people to trade with each other. The bazaar also functioned as an embassy without walls. People who worked in diplomacy and as ambassadors often went to local markets to see how much money people had and to understand how people felt. Any deals made here could affect who is friends and who is not, and any disagreements could turn into a big political crisis. Bazaars were places where people could talk to each other in an informal way. They were also places where trust and suspicion could be felt at the same time as the smells of cinnamon and musk. But the cultural exchange was not just about politics or business. It also applied to knowledge. In Baghdad's markets, people sold lots of books on philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. Many translated texts were written from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. Scholars and merchants worked together, and ideas traveled with goods. A book about maths might start in Baghdad, go to Damascus, and then end up in Andalusia, where it will inspire scholars in Cordoba. The bazaar was a place where people from different parts of the world met and traded goods. It was a place where East met West, both in terms of the goods sold, such as silk, and the languages spoken. Everyday interactions also led to a mix of cultures. Cooks tried new foods from other countries to make new meals. Artisans got ideas for patterns from imported textiles. Poets used images from exotic places in their writing. Even gossip had some of this cosmopolitanism in it. Stories from faraway lands mixed with local tales, making the Arab Bazaar more than just a place of trade. It was a place where different worlds met. Here, different cultures met, mixed, and changed each other. Imagine you are a medieval shopper. You are standing in a busy street, surrounded by goods and people from all over the world. It feels like the whole world has come to your doorstep. The bazaar was a marketplace, but it was also a place for entertainment and for the community to meet. People came not only to buy spices, silks, or carpets, but to see and be seen, to enjoy entertainment, and to experience the energy of the city. In the medieval Arab world, the bazaar was like a theater, cafe, and town square all in one place. Coffee houses and tea stalls quickly became popular places for people to chat. Men got together to drink sweet tea or coffee with sugar or cardamom in it while talking about poetry, politics, or the latest rumors from the palace. These gatherings mixed up the lines between leisure and news. A coffee house was a place where people would go to learn about new laws from the Sultan, hear poems about love, or even see people having a big argument about religion. Entertainment spilled into the lanes. Street performers amazed crowds with their acrobatics, juggling, and feats of strength. Snake charmers and trained monkeys attracted a crowd of curious children and travelers who were amused by the spectacle. Musicians with lots of drums and percussion instruments provided the music for daily life, while dancers, often accompanied by clapping and chants, performed in open courtyards or at festivals. The storytellers, the Hakawadis, were some of the most popular people. They sat on stools or platforms and recited epic poems and love stories that made the audience feel like they were somewhere else. Stories about brave heroes like Enter or amazing adventures from what would become 101 nights were shared in episodes. This meant that listeners wanted to come back every day to hear the next part. These stories taught people about right and wrong, remembered important cultural moments, and reminded audiences of their shared heritage. The bazaar was also a place where women would socialize, but the way they took part was different depending on the custom and region. Women often went shopping for things like household goods, fabrics, and perfumes. They were often accompanied by relatives or servants. People used these errands to make and strengthen friendships, agree on dowries, and grow their families' relationships. The bazaar was a place where people met and got to know each other, which helped to bring the community closer together. Festivals turned the market into a carnival. During Ramadan, lanterns lit up the night, sweet sellers offered trays of honey pastries, and storytellers kept crowds enchanted until dawn. On special days like Eid, whole families came to the market wearing their best clothes, filling the streets with happiness and fun. The bazaar was about more than just trade. People used to gather there to live. People came together to laugh, share stories, listen to music, and take part in rituals. This was a lively place where people socialized and enjoyed entertainment. It was like a theater in the medieval city. Even after the traders had packed up and the storytellers had finished their tales, the legacy of the medieval Arab bazaar still had a big impact on the world. These marketplaces were more than just places where people traded goods. They were the driving force behind globalization even before the word was invented. From Cairo's Karnal Khalili to Baghdad's busy markets and Damascus' Alhamdia, the bazaar was an important part of life in these cities and had a big influence on other countries too. The bazaar was an important part of the economy. It connected different regions and made them all part of one big network where people could trade things. Spices from India, silks from China, ivory from Africa, and furs from Central Asia all met here. They were resold and taken to Europe. If the bazaar had not been there to organize things, trade along the Silk Road and across the Mediterranean would have been much slower. These markets were the heart of medieval trade, bringing wealth and variety to societies that had never before known such abundance. The bazaars had a big cultural impact. They shared not only products, but also ideas. These ideas included mathematical concepts from India, medical texts from Greece, poetry from Persia, and technologies like papermaking from China. The booksellers of Baghdad's markets, for instance, helped make the city a center of learning, where knowledge was translated, debated, and shared. In this sense, the bazaar was like a library without walls, where knowledge traveled as quickly as silk or cinnamon. The bazaar was an important place for social life, where different communities met. It was a place where rich and poor people mixed together, where merchants and scholars talked, and where strangers became friends by doing things together like bargaining and storytelling. This sense of community made medieval cities lively and strong, bringing together different groups of people to form a shared identity. You can still feel the atmosphere of the medieval bazaar today. Modern markets, like Istanbul's Grand Bazaar and Morocco's souks, are similar to their ancestors. They keep the same architecture, smells, and rhythms. Even in online markets where you don't have to haggle, the idea of a bazaar still applies. You can still exchange things, make connections, and mix different cultures. In the end, the medieval era bazaar was about more than just trade. It was the center of cities where different empires met and where daily life, politics, and culture happened. Its history shows us that marketplaces are more than just places to buy and sell. These are the places where different cultures meet, create, and last.